Thanks, Kevin, for the introduction. I may move around a little bit. I think, can everybody hear me without the microphone? Okay. I'll keep my volume up as much as I can and for as long as I can, and that should be long enough to last us through this story. Some of you have probably read volume 2 of my trilogy on a history of the Ozarks, and there's one sentence about this story in volume 2, and it's because I discovered this story when I was working on volume 2, my Civil War era volume of History of the Ozarks, and I realized, hey, this is a much bigger story than I can do in a paragraph or even a couple pages in this book. So I'm just gonna, since I don't know the whole story yet, I'm just gonna let it sit, and I'm gonna mention Enoch Wolfe, who is one of the majors that I'm going to talk about tonight. I mention him in the book, and then I just go on. And next month, the Missouri Historical Review will contain an article on this subject. It'll be an in-depth look at the story that I'm talking about tonight. But you'll know pretty much the whole story by the time you get out of here, and you'll be able to pass it on and change whatever particulars you want to change as you pass it on. That's what we do. It's kind of the post office rule of storytelling. So as long as I don't hear those other versions, I won't be offended by this. But it's a good story, and I'll tell you, where I first came upon this feller, Enoch Wolfe, as Kevin said, I'm from Izard County. I was raised there, a little place called Violet Hill. And about 7 or 8 miles from where I grew up, and over on the eastern edge of Izard County, on the way to Ash Flat, there's a little community we call it Marn. It's spelled M-Y-R-O-N, Myron, but to the locals it's all Marn. And at Marn, between Franklin and Marn on the Strawberry River, there's a little farm there. And it's a Plumley family that owns the farm. It was a dairy farm the whole time I was growing up, but nobody dairy farms anymore, so it's not a dairy farm anymore. And on that farm, there's an old barn that kind of sits down below the old house there. And I was over there visiting one day. It's probably been about 15 years ago. Mr. Plumley, who's since passed away, showed me the guts of this old barn. It's a big barn, and inside it there was this old log corn crib. And these were not regular barn corn crib logs. I mean, these were big, squared off, hewed logs that had obviously come out of an old house somewhere. And that was Enoch Wolfe's old house place. Mr. Plumley's dad had helped take apart the house back in the 1920s, and when they were building this big new barn, they used the logs from that old house to build the corn cribs inside there, and then built the barn around the corn cribs. So the guy that we're talking about, that a lot of this story will revolve around, what's left of his old house is inside a barn, not far from the Strawberry River, in between Franklin and Marn. For us, barn and Marn rhyme. There's a barn in Fulton County. It's spelled B-Y-R-O-N. But this is where I first got interested in this story. And down below that barn, there's an old little iron fence, and it was just grown up in bars the day that I was there. But inside that little iron fence, there are 2 gravestones. It's Mr. and Mrs. Wolfe in there. They were buried on their farm. And so we're going to kind of learn the story of one of these guys today, Enoch Wolfe. And we'll go ahead and get started. We're going to go back to 1864. That's when almost all of this story takes place, is in 1864. So we know it's late in the Civil War. Things are not going all that well for the South. And General Sterling Price, a Missourian, had put together, mainly down in South Arkansas, he put together the biggest invading force of the Civil War, Confederate invading force to invade the state of Missouri. Price was a former governor of Missouri, and his goal was to capture St. Louis. And this is late summer, early fall of 1864 Things were not going well for the Confederacy anywhere at that time, certainly back east. So he not only hoped to capture St. Louis, but he hoped to maybe take some of the pressure off of the Confederate forces back east. And part of the reason he hoped to capture St. Louis was that a lot of the Union forces in Missouri had been transferred east of the Mississippi River to help in the war effort over there. And it looked like the perfect time, if there was ever going to be a time, to actually take a Confederate army up into Missouri and make a little racket and maybe capture the biggest city on this side of the Mississippi River. And so that's what they hoped to do. So in late September of 1864, September 20th is usually the day we identify as the first day of Price's invasion or Price's raid of Missouri. Over in the northeastern part of Arkansas, they crossed the state line. About 12,000 Confederate troops. Some historians have called this the largest cavalry force ever put together in the Civil War. That's if you consider a large number of dismounted cavalry part of the cavalry force. And if you know what dismounted cavalry is, it's basically just an infantryman who still technically belongs to the cavalry. It's a horse rider without a horse to ride. And so this is not a fast-moving army. If everyone had been on horseback, it might have been a different story, but there were a lot of dismounted cavalry. There were a lot of unarmed troops in this Confederate army that they put together. This was a low point for the Confederacy. They just kind of scraped together what they could. A lot of these people were probably forced into service. Some of them probably at gunpoint or with a threat of gunpoint were sort of arm twisted into joining this Confederate army and heading north. And Major Wolfe may have even done some of the arm twisting. I'm not really sure, but there were recruiters out operating around the state of Arkansas, gathering up troops for this Confederate army. They took off up into Missouri, over toward Pocahontas, that area, up in that part of Arkansas, and crossed the state line up toward Doniphan, Missouri. Our main guy here, Major Enoch Wolfe, was a member of what was called Ford's Battalion in Marmaduke's division of Price's army. Shelby had one of the divisions as well. There were, I don't remember exactly, but there were several divisions here in this army. And but Wolfe was in Marmaduke's division. And this army headed up toward St. Louis. And for several days, they were in Missouri without really being detected by the Union forces. Again, the Union Army had shrunk down quite a bit by September of 1864 in Missouri. And they were spread out around the state. There weren't a whole lot of them protecting St. Louis or Jefferson City. And a lot of the troops, a lot of the bluecoats in Missouri were militiamen by 1864. They were enrolled Missouri militia and different groups like that. And so they took off up toward the southeastern part of Missouri, and they were making pretty good progress. And Price made the mistake of listening to a couple of his lieutenants, his generals, who said, hey, what we really need to do before we go to St. Louis, we need to detour over here to the west, and we need to take out this little fort. That's at a place called Pilot Knob, and it's Fort Davidson. And today you can go up there and visit the recreated Fort Davidson, and they have a state park up there that's all about the Battle of Pilot Knob, and it's a pretty neat place to visit. It's not a place that those of us over in this part of the hills get to very often. It's just not on the way to anywhere unless you live over in that area. And but so Price agreed to detour his army and to try to take out this little fort. There were fewer than 2,000 troops who were protecting this little fort at Pilot Knob. And the reason it was there, that was as far down as the railroad went. So you could travel from St. Louis to Pilot Knob, Missouri by rail. And that was a big thing at that time in the Civil War. There were no rails almost to speak of in Arkansas, and not a whole lot of miles of rails in Missouri. So that's why the fort was there, to protect that rail line. And so Price agreed to go over there and to try to capture the fort. The Battle of Pilot Knob took place, I got a little ahead of myself here, on September 27th of 1864. And several of the Union troops were captured. There were many Confederates who were killed. Obviously, people on both sides were killed, but many more Confederates were killed at this battle. It was a little fort that kind of set out in a valley, and there were hills around it that sort of overlooked it, and had Price's army basically taken their time and put artillery on some of those hills where they could really shell that fort, they probably could have taken it without much trouble. But they were in a hurry because they were on a detour. You ever done that before? Detour on the way. Then you get in a hurry and you mess everything up, and that's kind of what happened. They ended up sending wave after wave of Confederate troops across this long open field to try to attack this fort. And that's never a very good idea, and it usually ends badly for people who are in those waves. And it did this time as well. And when it got to be about nightfall, the Union troops retreated inside the fort. This is the kind of fort you dream of when you're a little kid. This fort had a moat around it. I'm not sure how many of those there were in the Civil War, but it was a fort with an actual moat and a drawbridge. And so they retreated, and there were fewer than 1,500 of them, including probably a couple hundred civilians who were inside this fort at night. And the Confederates had surrounded it. They hadn't taken the fort, but they badly outnumbered the Union army, and they surrounded it. And that night, the Union brass got together and said, we don't really like the idea of what these folks might do to us tomorrow, because they're eventually going to capture this fort. They outnumber us so badly, so why don't we just sneak out of here? And that's what they did. It was kind of a Hollywood type escape. They snuck out in the middle of the night. As much as 1,500 people can sneak anywhere. And they lowered the drawbridge, got out of there. They got, by some accounts, probably within 50 yards of some of the sleeping Confederates in this escape. And once the last ones had gotten far enough away, they lit a fuse and exploded the fort behind them. And that woke the Confederates up. And what followed was several days, basically, of this Confederate army chasing these 1,200 or 1,300 Union troops through the hills of southeastern Missouri, and never really catching them and being able to pin them down. And ultimately, it put an end to any hopes that Price's army had of capturing St. Louis. It gave the Union time to figure out how to reposition their troops and fortify St. Louis and Jefferson City. And so what ends up happening is Price's Confederates pretty much skedaddle up the Missouri Valley over toward Kansas City. They end up all the way over in Kansas. They're being chased by a couple of Union armies by this point. And the Confederate army is just kind of falling apart as it goes, just like an old vehicle with all the gears and the bolts and stuff falling out of it. That's kind of the way I picture Price's army, is just driving it. It's making its way across the prairie, and stuff's just falling off of it the whole time. And somehow they make it back to Arkansas and get away from the Union army, but many of the troops never make it back. A lot of them just sort of go off on their own and think that we got a better chance if we just get off on our own and try to make it back home ourselves. And some of them, like Enoch Wolfe, are captured in this attempt to escape. At a little battle called the Battle of Mine Creek over in eastern Kansas, Enoch Wolfe was captured on the 25th of October, 1864. His horse was shot out from under him, and he unloaded his revolver at the Bluecoats as they came at him, but he ended up surrendering. They took him to Fort Scott, Kansas, and from there he was marched to the nearest railhead, which was in the town of Warrensburg, Missouri, over east of Kansas City. He and more than 250 other Confederate prisoners were placed in cattle cars, and they were shipped across state to St. Louis. and they would end up in this place right here, in Gratiot Street Prison. What does that look like? Doesn't look like a prison, does it?
No.
It's because it wasn't before the Civil War. It was a medical school. It was McDowell Medical College in St. Louis, and they turned it into a prison during the Civil War. So that's why it looks kind of like a college, because it was originally. And so more than 250 of these Confederate prisoners of war get put in Gratiot Street Prison. Like about any prison in the Civil War, it wasn't a place you wanted to be, and it certainly increased your chances of dying because there wasn't a lot of food to go around, there wasn't a lot of health care, and it was just in general not a good place to go. But that's where Wolfe ended up. By the time he got there, it was early November, and on his second day in Gratiot Street Prison, Wolfe was marched into a large room where he was surrounded by officers in blue, and one of them read an official order out loud. And the gist of that order was that Wolfe had been sentenced to die before a firing squad, and for something that Major Wolfe had not, in fact, done. And he may not even have known the people who committed the act that he was to die for, which we will get to in a minute. But they had sentenced him to die by firing squad on November 11th, 1864. Now, Wolfe knew that the Union authorities in St. Louis were serious about this, because on the train ride in, Wolfe and his fellow Confederate prisoners of war had discovered that the Union authorities had already executed several Confederate prisoners in late October. So this was no joking matter. And so we'll take a step back and see what was going on here. A lot of people spent a lot of time reading about the Civil War, but never come across the fact that both sides in the Civil War, beginning in 1863, practiced official retaliation. Eye for an eye executions were carried out in the Civil War. And this goes back on the Union side, this goes back to what we call the Lieber Code. This was drafted by a German Jewish legal scholar. He was an immigrant to the United States, and at the behest of the U.S. Army, he drafted basically the rules of conduct for the Army. And the Lieber Code would eventually form the basis for what today we call the Geneva Conventions, the international laws of war, basically, that all armies are expected to abide by. And of course, they don't always abide by the Geneva Conventions, but this is the genesis of the Geneva Conventions, the Lieber Code. And Article 59 of the Lieber Code states that all prisoners of war are liable to the infliction of retaliatory measures. In other words, retaliatory executions can be used legally, according to the Lieber Code, in wartime. A couple months after the Lieber Code was drafted and approved in 1863, President Lincoln issued a warning to the Confederates that the Union Army would carry out eye for an eye executions. And the reason he did this in 1863, this was also a time when the Union Army was using more and more black troops. And one of the things that happened to a lot of black troops is when they were captured, they were often executed. They were often just killed right on the spot. And that probably won't be a surprise to anybody, because a lot of these, some of them were formerly enslaved, some of them may have been free before the war, but a lot of Confederates were offended by the idea of the Union Army making uniformed soldiers out of formerly enslaved people or black men in general. And so a lot of these troops were the victims of these unfair executions. And that's the main reason that Lincoln did that, was basically to try to scare the Confederacy into stopping that practice. It didn't necessarily work, but that was the main goal. In this case, we're talking about executions that didn't have anything to do with black soldiers, but it was an army-wide practice that eventually went into became part of the official war effort. Lincoln himself admitted that he never liked the idea of retaliation, and when given the chance, he often prevented the execution of soldiers. Lincoln stepped in a lot of cases and spared the life of people, and many of the radical Republicans accused Lincoln of being too soft when it came to such harsh measures. But that's where we get Civil War retaliation, and that's why when Major Enoch Wolfe shows up in Gratiot Street Prison in early November of 1864, he is sentenced to death in eye for an eye retaliation. And so we'll figure out what it was that they were retaliating for. And for this story, we go back a little ways again to southeast Missouri. Like a lot of places in the borderlands where you had almost an even number of pro-Confederate and pro-Union people in the Civil War, southeast Missouri was deeply, deeply divided in the Civil War to the point where the Civil War becomes very much a local and personal thing for those people. They're not necessarily thinking about bigger war aims, who's gonna capture the Mississippi River, or are we going to keep Memphis or Nashville or St. Louis for that matter. Their war becomes a very personal, very local war. And this particular local war kind of boiled down to a Union outfit, the 3rd Missouri State Militia Cavalry. These are pro-Union militiamen who are operating out of Fort Davidson at Pilot Knob, and they've got a string of little forts down there in southeastern Missouri. And then their mortal enemies are the 15th Missouri Cavalry, who are Confederates. And they are under the command, the 3rd MSM are under the command of Major James Wilson. He's our 2nd major in our 2 majors in the President. And the Confederates are under the command of the guy who's pictured here, Colonel Timothy Reeves. And as the war went on in 1862 and 63 and into 1864, these 2 units, one Union and one Confederate, just became truly mortal enemies to the point where they would probably not think twice about executing prisoners that they had captured from one side or another. And we don't have time to go into all the things that led up to how much they hated each other by late 1864, but they did absolutely hate each other by this time. And so what happens is, as Price's army is invading Missouri in September and October of 1864, they're capturing Union troops on the way up there, on the way up towards St. Louis. They capture several more Union troops in the Battle of Pilot Knob. And in that period after the Battle of Pilot Knob, after the fort's been blowed up, as we say in the Ozarks, and as the Confederates are chasing this little Union outfit through the hills up there, they've got more than 400 Union prisoners of war with them. Price's Confederate Army does. And finally they realize this is just too much trouble to drag these prisoners of war around with us. And so on the morning of October 3rd, they're getting ready to parole these troops. And that was not an unusual thing for armies to capture a big bunch of people, whether it was a Union Army or Confederate Army, to capture a big bunch of the enemy, and then after a while just parole them, take their weapons away, maybe parts of their uniform, any horses or anything like that they had, and just send them off because it's too much trouble to take care of you, to feed you and all that stuff when we can't hardly do that ourselves to start with. And so as they were getting ready to parole these troops, uprode Colonel Reeves and one of his lieutenants. And he asked that the Union troops be lined up on a field out there. And they're up about 50 miles west of St. Louis at this point in the Missouri Valley, just kind of out in the middle of nowhere, out in farm country up there. If you know Missouri, it's in Franklin County, which is just west of Missouri, up the Missouri River. And so they line all these Union prisoners of war up there, and Reeves rides up and down the line, and as they get to every prisoner of war, they ask them to state their name and their rank and their outfit. And every time someone claims to be from the 3rd MSM, Colonel Reeves and the 15th Missouri Cavalry's mortal enemies, Reeves has them take 2 steps forward. And after a while, as most of us would, the rest of the troops start to smell a rat. Something's a little fishy about this. And so eventually they get 6 of them to take 2 steps forward. There are several more prisoners from the 3rd MSM in there, but as they get to them, they lie about their outfits and say they're from somewhere else. And after they go through all the troops, they've got 1 officer, Major James Wilson, and 5 enlisted men, all from the 3rd Missouri State Militia. And Reeves and his lieutenant take those 6 men about a mile away, over across a couple of hills and to a creek bottom somewhere. They hear gunshots, and then they ride back with no prisoners. And they've executed Major Wilson and 5 of his enlisted men over there, and they let the rest of them go. They parole all the more than 400 Union soldiers. So it was clearly a targeted act at their mortal enemies from southeast Missouri that they had murdered, or I guess they would call it execute. But either way, they had killed them in a form that most of us would see as sort of against the laws of war. But the laws of war didn't mean anything by this point in Missouri in the Civil War. It was not a civil war to Missourians on either side. And so the Confederates rode off. So this was the basis for Major Wolfe being sentenced to death. Now, it took about 3 weeks before the public found out about these executions. We know that some of the paroled men got back to St. Louis and told what had happened, but the Union Army had never sent anybody to look for these bodies. And about 3 weeks later, a young man who was out picking up persimmons, it was that time of year, discovered these bodies. And it made the newspapers before the Army even found out about it. And when it made the newspapers, the Army finally sent a quartermaster detail down to the area to see what was going on. And they found the 6 bodies. A couple of them had been partially eaten by hogs to the point that they were pretty much unrecognizable. But they knew they could identify some of the bodies, certainly Major Wilson's body, and they knew from who was missing and who had never showed back up sort of who the other troops were. And what happened is, just a few days after all of this happened, and Major Wilson's body was taken to St. Louis, and it lay in state in the courthouse in a way that usually only very high-ranking officers were honored in that way. The Union brass ordered that enlisted men, the Confederate enlisted prisoners of war in Gratiot Street Prison, be executed to account eye for an eye for these men who were killed. And that's what happened. Somehow they miscounted and ended up executing 6 Confederate enlisted men instead of 5. And I never was able to figure out why that happened, how they ended up turning 5 into 6, because you did eye for an eye executions with people of equal rank. And at that time, there was no Confederate major in Gratiot Street Prison for them to execute as eye for an eye for Major James Wilson. So they had to wait. But they did pick out these enlisted men. They took them out to a place sort of on the edge of town where they had a little fort set up there. And they took pine poles and drove them in the ground, and then put little like makeshift boards for seats on them. And they set the 6 Confederate prisoners of war on these seats, on these pine poles. They blindfolded them, gave them a chance to say any last words. There were some 3,000 people gathered around to watch these public executions. Most of the people were Union soldiers. And the 10th Kansas was given the sort of unsavory job of being the firing squad, and many of them expressed a reluctance to do that, but their officer sort of reasoned with them and got them to carry through with the duty anyway. They executed the 6 Confederate prisoners. So all this had happened before Major Enoch Wolfe made it to Gratiot Street Prison. So he knew this was a serious thing. When they marched him inside the big room in the prison and said, "You have been sentenced to death to atone for the death of Major Wilson," he knew that this was a real thing. And that was, and so it was Enoch Wolfe, who was not part of Colonel Reeves's 15th Missouri, probably didn't even know them, but he had been chosen to die to atone for the death of Major Wilson. So here's when the 6 Confederate prisoners were executed. And this is all very detailed. The reports are very detailed in the St. Louis newspapers. There were reporters at this execution, and we have a lot of information about what all happened to these soldiers. This is Major General William Rosecrans, who was the commanding officer there in the District of Missouri. And he was the head Union guy in St. Louis and over all of Missouri, and he's the one who ordered the eye for an eye executions in 1864. Rosecrans was he was kind of the disgraced general who had been demoted after the Battle of Chickamauga. He was often blamed for the Union loss in the Battle of Chickamauga, and so they sent him to Missouri, which was less important, obviously, for the Union people in Washington, D.C. than was the area back east. And Rosecrans was a guy who was also kind of paranoid as well. He had spent a lot of his career being paranoid about these shadowy groups of underground pro-Confederates that he feared were rising up. And by 1864, one of these groups was called the Order of American Knights. And Rosecrans was convinced that there were thousands of these Oaks, as we call them, the acronym Order of American Knights, hanging around Missouri, just waiting to rise up in opposition to the Union Army the first chance they got. And that was part of what fueled his paranoia. There's no evidence that that movement was ever as big as he feared it was, but that fear is what motivated him to really take this strong stance and have these troops executed in 1864. So what happens is, less than 24 hours before the November 11th execution is to take place, guess who sends a telegram to St. Louis saying, "Hold off just a minute." It's the president, Abraham Lincoln. On November 10th, Rosecrans gets a telegram from Lincoln saying, "Please stay the execution of Major Enoch Wolfe temporarily and send me your report. I want to find out what's going on." And so Wolfe gets a temporary reprieve by President Lincoln on November 10th. and he's still in a ball and chain in a little room in Gratiot Street Prison somewhere, but he's alive for now, and the question becomes, what happened? What motivated President Lincoln to sort of at the last minute? And as you can imagine, as the story progressed over the years and years after the Civil War, it did become a last minute story. You can see versions of the story where the firing squad are already lined up and ready, and Wolfe is already there, blindfolded. It happened almost 24 hours before, or a little less than 24 hours before he was to be executed, that Lincoln sent this telegram. So what happened? Well, to give away the ending, Major Wolfe survives the war. He is not executed. He will live to be an old man. He lives about 45 years after the Civil War ends. And he tells his version of the story to family members and eventually to newspaper reporters and things like that. And Wolfe's version of what happened was that it was his Masonic brothers, fellow Masons, who came to his aid. According to Wolfe, the warden of Gratiot Street Prison came to visit him one day, and they exchanged secret signs, secret signals from the Masonic Lodge, the fraternity, and that it was the warden of the prison himself who sort of rallied local Masons in St. Louis to come to Wolfe's aid. Of course, as you would expect, if this is what saved Wolfe's life, we'll never know because there's no paper trail, there's no hard and fast evidence of this. It's not like the Masons put it in the paper the next day that we secretly kept a Confederate major from being executed for the death of a Union major, especially when these were Unionists who had supposedly saved the life of Enoch Wolfe. But that was his story, was that both the warden of the prison and the Baptist preacher that the warden of the prison brought in to baptize Wolfe. Wolfe was a Baptist, and I would assume he'd probably been baptized at some point if he already identified as a Baptist here in Arkansas, but I guess he wasn't taking any chances. There might have been a little bit of him sticking out at some point, and so they got a Baptist preacher there in St. Louis who was actually from New Jersey. He wasn't probably not a hellfire and brimstone Baptist that Wolfe was used to, but he was a guy. They got a big bathtub and dunked him in a bathtub to baptize him. And this Baptist preacher, Wolfe said, was also a Mason in St. Louis. And so that's what Wolfe went to his grave believing that it had been Masons who had saved his life. Now, it may have been, I don't know, but what I do know from doing research and going through the records, it seems just as likely that it was two women who saved Wolfe's life. There were two very well-placed society women in St. Louis. They were sisters-in-law. And one of them was the older sister of Cyrus Schofield. If you've ever had a Schofield Bible, that's the Schofield Bible guy. He was a former Confederate soldier. He was from Michigan. Not a lot of former Confederate soldiers from Michigan, but he had been a teenager visiting family down in Tennessee when the war started. He got swept up in the hoopla of secession. First thing he knew, he was in the Confederate Army. And after about a year, he managed to get out of the Army, and he went to live with his sister and his brother-in-law in St. Louis, kind of quietly, just sort of hiding out there. And he spent the rest of the war there in St. Louis studying to be a lawyer, and later would become famous for his Schofield Reference Bible. But this was, one of them was his sister, and she probably had a soft spot for people who had as far as she was concerned, just made the wrong decision by joining the Confederacy. And it's more likely that these two women thought that it was a very bad look for the city of St. Louis to have executed these 6 Confederate enlisted men. And the last thing they wanted to see was yet another eye for an eye or retaliatory execution take place. So what they did is they got together a petition, 2 petitions. One of them they took around and got a lot of the prominent Union men of St. Louis, men who were not part of the military, but older men there in St. Louis. Many of them were very prominent, industrialist, wealthy Union men, to sign a petition. We have those petitions have survived, and I've got copies of those petitions. There are more than 50 signatures on one. The other one was a prominent ladies of St. Louis petition. There are about 25 signatures on that one, and some of these were, again, they were pretty much all very prominent Union women who signed these petitions. And they took these petitions to General Rosecrans the night before the execution. And they were unaware that the execution had already been temporarily stayed. And they couldn't get in to see General Rosecrans, so they came back the very next morning and gave him these petitions. And so they have survived as part of the military record. And it seems likely that this probably played some role as well. And that very same day, on November 10th, the day that Lincoln stayed the execution temporarily, Lincoln received himself 3 telegrams from St. Louis. And they were from 3 different prominent Union men in St. Louis, all of them imploring the president to have mercy on Major Wolfe and to spare his life. And again, we don't know if any of these 3 different actions were the immediate cause of Lincoln deciding to send that telegram, or if it was just sort of the whole kit and caboodle of them leading to Lincoln doing this. I would say more than likely it was the fact that all of these things are going on at the same time. That you've got these 2 ladies who are gathering all these petitions from prominent Union people who don't want to see Wolfe executed. You've got people wiring the president, asking him to have mercy on Major Wolfe. And you've got potentially, allegedly, Masons working behind the scenes to save his life as well. What it reflected was the fact that St. Louis had, as a community, had sort of turned against the idea of these retaliatory executions. It just wasn't something that people in St. Louis were ready to put up with. It didn't save the 6 enlisted Confederates, but it eventually did save Major Wolfe from the same fate. And so in the end, we probably will never know exactly which of these, if any of these, carried out this kind of life-saving mission for Major Wolfe, but all of them together end up saving his life. And so I would say, really, it was popular sentiment against execution that saved him. I don't know. We know that in one of Wolfe's letters to General Rosecrans, he actually invokes his Masonic Brotherhood in that letter. He mentions something about being a Mason in that letter. I'm 95% sure that it fell on deaf ears with Rosecrans, who was Catholic. And at that time, the Pope was severely against Masons. The Masons were often seen as an anti-Catholic organization. And so it's very unlikely that Rosecrans would have responded positively to a Masonic plea. And even Rosecrans' second in command was Roman Catholic as well. So I don't know about that, but certainly we know that something ended up convincing Lincoln, and there's no evidence that Lincoln was a Mason either. So that it's hard to tell. But this is Major Wolfe as an old man. The letter to the left, and you can't read it, it's too light and it's too far away for you to read that. The letter to the left is actually President Lincoln's follow-up to Rosecrans. Several days after he sent the telegram telling Rosecrans to hold off on the execution, Lincoln eventually wrote back and said, well, I've given it a second thought and do whatever you want. So Lincoln's stay of execution was not permanent. He eventually did turn back over the authority to Rosecrans to do whatever he wanted. And eventually it was for some, and again, I have no idea why the execution wasn't followed through with, because there's no paper trail, but at some point Rosecrans decided not to follow through with the execution, which he certainly could have done. He could have done that, but he did not follow through with the execution. And a few weeks later, Rosecrans was fired by Lincoln and removed. Nothing to do with this. Lincoln didn't like him, and most of the Union high command didn't like Rosecrans. He was there as kind of a political appointment. And when Lincoln was safely reelected, which also happened in November 1864, Lincoln said, okay, goodbye Rosecrans, early retirement for you. You can go back home. But Rosecrans still was there long enough where he could have carried through with this execution. And we know that some of his officers tried to convince him to carry through with the execution, but he never did. And again, there's no explanation for that. There's no letter, there's no response. There was just nothing where he ever said why he decided not to follow through with that execution. But thankfully for Major Enoch O. Wolfe, he didn't. Wolfe got really, really sick in Gratiot Street Prison. He sort of withered away until finally, it was probably a second episode of saving Wolfe's life, was the doctor at Gratiot Street Prison who finally convinced the Union command to send him somewhere else because he was so sick. And they sent him to Johnson's Island, Lake Erie, and off the shore from Sandusky, Ohio. He only spent a couple weeks at Johnson's Island before he was swapped for a Union major. He was sent down to Virginia, and they exchanged him for a Union major POW before the war was over. He got his Confederate pay in Richmond and made his way back to Arkansas, and he arrived back home before the war was over. And as you can imagine, surprised the dickens out of his family when he showed up, because the last they knew of, he was supposed to be executed. But then he shows up, and it's really him. It's not an imposter. And that's how the E.O. Wolfe story ends. Wolfe himself remained a diehard Confederate, a diehard rebel for the rest of his life. He became a regular at Confederate reunions in northern Arkansas. He even made one trip to Richmond, Virginia, the year that they erected the big monument to Jefferson Davis. He went to Richmond. He was an old man by that point. It was in the early 1900s. But he went to Richmond to see that. And finally, very late in his life, wrote his memoirs. And some of them survived and were published in local newspapers from time to time, though much of his memoirs apparently disappeared at some point. I'd love to know what happened to him. That'd be wonderful. But some of them did survive, and we do know a little bit about his life before the Civil War, which included a trip to the California gold fields, time in the Mexican War. He had a very, very eventful life, and had a story to tell for the rest of his life, and one that got told a lot. And it was really fun to get in and look through the records, what survives in the archives and the libraries, and to try to figure out exactly what happened to this story. That's the first time that anybody's ever dug into that story in that way, to try try to see what happened with the two generals and the president. So any questions from anyone?
Was he related to the wolf here in Baxter County?
No, I tried, I did a lot of genealogical research on him, and I found no evidence that they were related, even though they lived pretty close to each other. This wolf, he was actually born in southern Ohio, and his family lived in the Republic of Texas for a while before they settled in what today is Ozarks County. At that time, it was Fulton County, Arkansas. So no connection that I was ever able to make. But he was of German descent, like the wolves at Norfolk.